Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Mastering Midlife, How to Thrive When the World Asks the Most of You. Today, I am thrilled to have as my guest Michele Darwin, who is the founder and executive director for the Windward Foundation, whose mission is to help ease the burden of caregiving for people living with Alzheimer's. She's been in marketing for quite a few years, and for the last 20 years, she's shown her big heart by being on the boards of several nonprofits. Michele, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I was talking to your brother, who is both your brother and a colleague, and we were talking about caregiving, and that my listeners have been asking for someone to be on the show to talk about this because, in the demographic that we serve on this podcast, people are caught between having children, between having careers, and then having elderly parents with a myriad of challenges. Alzheimer's being, one of the most horrific, and you deal with this every day.
I do. Sean and I are actually co-founders of the Windward Foundation. So we kind of went down that path after watching our parents care for my grandmother, who had dementia. And then in turn, my dad received that same horrible diagnosis. And I played a pretty big role in caring for him with my mom. We moved him down to Dallas so that I could get a little bit more involved. So not only is this my job, but, personally, I've kind of lived the life more times than I'd like to. I don't think
right.
Any wishes.
Before you get professional, what was it like caring for your dad?
It's exhausting. That's the number one thing, right? We are trying to juggle our family, our children, our home life, our jobs, and it's exhausting. And the caregivers are kind of the lost population, right? The caregivers forget to. It's not so much that they forget, but the priority all goes to the person they're caring for, and they miss their own doctor's appointments. They start canceling, their own social activities, and it really becomes a tremendous emotional stress on top of what can be, depending on your family situation, a financial stress also. So, it's a beatdown, for lack of a better term.
I wrote a book called Only Tens, and about 90% of the way through the book, I was asked to give a talk on it in California, and I was all excited to give the talk. I was doing my tens, things were firing on all cylinders, and my mother went down for the count in Florida, and I had to move her to Virginia. And there is now a chapter in the book Only Tens. It's called "And Then Your Mother Comes to Town," because of the breakdown of my tens. I had my act together, man, before she came here. And as soon as she came to town, it was only in hindsight in writing the chapter that the most important thing was getting her settled. At some point I was going to be able to take some of my own life back, but getting her settled was going to take everything I had. So I have my own firsthand knowledge of this.
So do you have siblings that helped you? Because there's so many different dynamics, but, in our case, my dad didn't live with us, but we moved them. We kind of collectively sat down and said to my mom, this is too much for you. Caring for someone with Alzheimer's is no fun. And it was tearing her apart. And she was calling every week, Dad took the car, Dad did this, Dad did that. And so her children, we're all working, we all have our own families. We can't just be there in 5 minutes. She was 3 hours away,
right,
without traffic. So we kind of sat them down and said, you can move to Northern Virginia and be closer to your boys, or you can move to Texas, where I was at the time, my sister, or you can move to Texas, and we'll support you no matter what, but something has to give. I was 24 hours away. I'd have to book a flight and, fly down there. And then my brothers had their own families and their own professional careers, and their children were very involved. So they couldn't just drop everything. It would take hours to coordinate everything before they can get in the car and drive down to help her.
So let's start here with that conversation.
Yeah.
So how do you have these conversations, either with the spouse who's caring for the elderly parent, and you say, you can't do this anymore, or the elderly parent, or you have to say you are no longer independent? How do you have these conversations?
It's probably one of the most difficult things to have to do. No one, even someone in their elder years, wants to give up their independence. So, you can have the conversation, successfully have the conversation, and 5 minutes after you walk out the door, they change their mind, So there, this is there's so many layers of impact on the caregiver, because they want to do what's best for their family. They want to do what's best for their job. They want to do what's best for their spouse. They want to do what's best for their children. And you don't really, there's no guidebook, every situation is different. You're caring for maybe a younger child, a parent, a grandparent. In the case of what I do, the cost of caring, memory care for someone with a dementia, Parkinson's dementia, can be $10,000 or $15,000 a month. So add on top of that the financial burden, and it's just a treadmill. You feel like you're on a treadmill going nowhere.
Does long-term care insurance help with dementia and Alzheimer's? Because I know it helps with nursing care.
It does. So if you have long-term care insurance, it does help. But it doesn't pay for it all.
No, I bought it for both my parents when they were still somewhat healthy, and my ex-wife was just brilliant that way. She bought it for us, and it was affordable when they were still somewhat healthy. So maybe I paid a few extra years, but thank God, right?
Right. And my my mom has that now. Financially, that wasn't a tremendous burden in our family. Memory care for my dad. But that's not always the case, and you're also, caregiving isn't always for an elderly parent. It might be for a spouse. It might be for a child. Sometimes you're caring for someone with a condition that they will heal and they will get better, and then you can kind of see your way out of that role as a caregiver. But when we're talking about older people and Alzheimer's and dementia, that type of thing, terminal cancers, you don't have an out. You're a caregiver to the end.
Terminal cancer is almost kinder because there is an end in sight. As far as my dad died of Parkinson's, and that was just a slow march, right?
Right.
And so that I think of Parkinson's as the opposite of Alzheimer's, where his mind stayed as sharp as a tack, and his body just shut down.
His body shut down.
Right. So watching that was probably the most horrible thing I've ever seen. So someone comes to you. You probably have you're a magnet for these conversations. Someone comes to you and says, "My mom or dad or my spouse is slipping. They're just and it's getting to the point where it's dangerous." What's the first thing to start to think about?
So I think the first thing to think about is having those difficult conversations. And that starts with your immediate family. If you're going to take on a role as a caregiver, your siblings, if you're caring for an older parent. Oftentimes in our demographic, we're dealing with a parent who's caring for the other parent, right? So I don't know if you ran into that in your own personal life, but that's often the case. We're dealing with a parent who's caring for their spouse, and the toll on them is devastating. And that's usually you start seeing the health decline of your healthy parent, right? Mm-hmm. And that's when you realize, but those conversations need to happen immediately with your siblings, and sit down and kind of develop a roadmap and develop a game plan on how you want to address this. If you're dealing with siblings, then there's conversations that need to happen on who's going to play what role, right? Everyone can't be involved in everything because it's too complicated.
And a lot of times siblings don't want to be involved.
And they often don't want to be.
Some want to be caregivers, some want nothing to do with it. So family dynamic starts to get into this.
Right. And that's a tough one, right? And we get a lot of calls about, the family dynamics. My siblings don't support me, that's a tough one, right? But I think that's a conversation that you have to develop some kind of roadmap. So you need to understand, are you dealing with someone who has a terminal illness? Are you dealing with someone who has an illness that will eventually hopefully get better? Are you going to be caring for someone who has diabetes and requires dialysis, and you're going to have to be taking them to dialysis 1, 2, 3, right? So you kind of have to understand.
Can you repeat that? Because you just went away. Can you just repeat the dialysis piece again? And I'll edit it.
Okay. I think you may be dealing with someone who has an issue, diabetes or something that leads to dialysis. And part of your caregiving is going to involve daily, weekly trips to dialysis, right? So you kind of you have to have the conversation and understand, what the big picture looks like, so that you can start to decide what your roles are, right? And kind of understand, what if you're working full time, how many days can you afford to take off to take your loved one to the doctors? Is there another family member that might be able to help you? Is it all on you? Can you hire an outside caregiver to give you some reprieve? So you need to understand what you're dealing with so that you can kind of develop a roadmap. So that conversation has to happen either with, I'll use an example as a parent, with your mom. Say I'm caring for my dad. My dad has a diagnosis of dementia. My mom is now responsible fully for his care. They live together. Nobody else lives near them. So what can we as a family do to help ease her burden and ease her stress? That's kind of like the big picture. But in the short term, how is mom able to drive? Is mom going to be able to drive him to his appointments? Are we going to have to hire someone to work on transportation? Is mom capable of, making sure he takes all his medicine as required? I know with Parkinson's, if you helped care for your dad with Parkinson's, it's very important that they take their medication at a very specific time. So, you need to make sure that you're able, the person that your family member is able to do that, right? And then there's all kinds of other conversations that need to happen around things like palliative care, right? We think about palliative care as those final days, when someone's maybe in hospice, but that's really, I urge people to kind of change that dialogue to comfort care, right? What do we need to do to make sure our loved one is comfortable during this journey? Because you should be having this conversation if you have cancer. Your physician, his job is to make your cancer better, So the hope is that you will receive your treatment and you will live a healthy, long life. But you still should be talking about palliative care, because that's what keeps you comfortable during your treatment, right? So your quality of life is the best that it can be. So those conversations need to happen.
So in today's society, we're like you were far away from your parents. Most of us are far away from our parents, and we can't uproot, right? What do you do? What do you do when the parent refused to move or make a change, and you have a life 1,000 miles away?
That's probably the most difficult thing of all, right? And they can only do that for so long. It's just a fact. So they're either going to willingly make some changes and perhaps move closer to you, or they're going to find themselves in a situation where one of them can no longer care for the other one, and they're going to be forced into that same decision, right? So I think that's where those family conversations are so important, because you have the conversation and you kind of take on roles. Someone needs to check. I'm using the example mom and dad. It's just a little bit easier for this conversation, but
it works perfectly for this conversation, because 90% of people.
Right. Someone needs to check on mom. Someone needs to make sure that mom's eating, you know? So, you know, those kind of things can often be guided by community where they live, right? Do they live in an area where they have friends? Do they live in an area where they're active in their church? And as a family member, I would encourage people to know those people, right? Know their neighborhood community, have those phone numbers, know their and familiarize themselves with that, because those are most likely the people that are going to be the first people that can get to your parents in the case of an
And then
emergency,
also
right?
know that there are social services available for people.
There are, right. And so, you know, you have the conversations within your family and your network, your community. And then, you know, as a family member, you need to understand what's the closest hospital, what's the closest fire station, what's the closest police station. If you're dealing with someone with dementia, those conversations need to happen long distance, right? The police station needs to know that the person at this address has Alzheimer's disease, right? The
I would
person,
never have thought of that. What a great point.
you know, it's important because otherwise that call is going to come in a panic, you know, where someone gets in the car and drives away and their spouse is like, this happened with our dad, you know, my mom would call us and say, Dad took the car. She didn't like confrontation, so she did not want to take the keys away from him, but he would take the car. And then she would call us hours away, you know, and tell us that he took the car. And, you know, we were on the phone with police and, you know, trying to figure out what's our best recourse in this situation, you know. So I think it's important that the first responders know who your family is, right? Especially, again, kind of focused on dementia, but if your family or your parents are living a great distance away from you and dealing with any kind of medical condition, you know, you need to know what's available so that you can make that call if necessary and not have to explain from the very beginning, you know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. So you come at it from a very caring and loving heart. So now we take it where someone like me comes in when I'm supporting someone, and I support people with clear boundaries, because often I find people tearing themselves up for other people's choices.
Right.
So you're willing to care for you're willing to care for them. You're willing to know what they need to do. You're willing to even spend money and take care of all those things, move them closer so it doesn't completely tear your family apart and all that stuff. And they refuse to do it. At that point, for me, I would step in and say, you can't do anything. So my own personal experience is I moved my mother when things got really bad and my mother was just completely down for the count. I moved her here to Virginia. She hated being here in Virginia. She was in, I gave her assisted living, 2.5 miles from my house. And she did not like coming out in the winter, which I don't blame her. So she wasn't coming to some of the basketball games. She wasn't seeing her grandchildren, no matter how many times I asked and all that. And then she got better up here. Not better enough to take care of herself, but better enough so that she didn't remember how bad she was in Florida, that she was dying in Florida and she needed to come up here. She moved herself back down to Florida, and she said, and she got one of my, she got some money together and moved herself back to Florida. But I said to her, I fixed everything. So so this is where you hear my cold heart. I wrote a book on boundaries. So I told her, if you move to Florida, there's nothing I can do for you. I am not going to be flying to Florida every time you trip, every time you need to go to the doctor. I can't do it. I fixed everything. You were here. You were comfortable. You were near your grandchildren. You go do what you need to do. And she moved herself to Florida. And within 2 weeks, she was sick. And within 2 weeks, she was calling me saying, why am I alone? Nobody helps me. Her friends would call me and say, how come nobody helps your mom? And I really, I have good boundaries. I know who I am. I know what I did, right? It tore my brother and sister apart, right? because she made those choices. So how do people deal with that kind of thing?
So, to be totally honest, I had to set boundaries too. I might have been willing to do a lot for my parents, but it got a little crazy. It got a little crazy when, I was getting calls for everything, and then I would go down to visit them or visit my mom. Now, granted, she was dealing with a tremendous amount of stress, but, I would go down to see my mom and she needed something so ridiculous I could have done it on the phone, and how many times did I have to do that before I realized, Michelle, set some boundaries. I think when it comes to caring for our family, though, you're not wrong. You're not wrong, because that dynamic will destroy life as you know it, right? It will destroy your family. And maybe that's a little strong, but that's how I feel.
I don't think it's strong. I think the caregivers get sick. I think the caregiver's family suffers. And I don't think the caregivers give themselves permission to set those boundaries so that, it can, not, my sister was willing to play bad guy and tell my mother, you're going, if you do this, you are, hurting Mark by moving far away. Like, you're going to make, because he cares for you. Like, so we were able to play bad cop, good cop. But in the end, I had to find the fortitude to know I did what I could do. And God bless her, she got to make the decisions that she wanted to make for her life and the consequences that went with them.
Right, right. But I think that's important, right? I mean, we can care for our parents without having it destroy our life. We can. And it's not easy. It's, your work is going to be affected because, I'm sorry, like, you can do a great job at work when you have all this on your mind, but you're not doing your best because you've got so much on your mind, or you're in the middle of a really important presentation you're putting together, or a really important meeting, or an award ceremony at school for your children, and you get the call and you have to stop. And, it happens to every one of us, so we do the best we can, but, this is, I mean, it's a huge problem. So if we don't set boundaries, we're just putting ourselves in a situation where we're going to not be the best we can be, right?
I believe in the life preserver and the oxygen mask on ourselves first.
I do too.
And then we can be of help to whoever it is that we need to be of help.
I think there's a lot of people that misunderstand that too. They misunderstand that, and they think that, you're not caring as you should, but you are, because just like the oxygen example that you use, you're on a flight, you're on a plane, you're a parent with a baby. What good is it? What good are you to your baby if you don't put the oxygen on yourself, right? So I think, that's a good reminder. You could probably have a whole podcast just on that, right?
Oh, don't worry, I sprinkle it into every podcast.
Yeah. Yeah.
So tell me. So we get past the conversation. We get them into care. What's available? What help is available? What resources are available for people who have to deal with this? And everything that you tell me, I'll put in the show notes.
Absolutely. So, every community, or most every community, I can't speak across the country, but most communities have a center for the aging. And our office is in Fairfax County. So there's Fairfax County Center for the Aging, Loudoun County Center for the Aging. So that's a really good resource when you're caring for an older parent, right? Seek out those communities, the community services, and find out what's available in your community. Most often there's senior centers that offer daycare type of facilities, where if you're a working caregiver, your loved one can go to a daycare center. Now, granted, they have to want to go, right? But, there's daycare that's available, even for people with dementia. There's some very good caregiving places, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 type of caregiving in our area in Virginia. There are senior centers all over the place that offer activities and friendships and, places where your loved one can actually go and socialize, and they don't feel like it's a sentence for them. So, it's no easy feat sometimes with our older parents to get them to participate in social activities, because one of the things that happens as we get older is people just tend to close themselves off. I'm not exactly sure why, but so sometimes that's a discussion that has to happen a few times to get them interested. But I see many, many seniors and caregivers who, when they get their loved one involved in that kind of situation, it opens up. They can get out and do what they need to do, and they take less time off of work. A lot of the county governments offer transportation to and from. So there's like in the DC area, the Metro. Gosh, I'm blank on that, but there's a bus that will come pick you up at your home.
So what do you look at? So you're Googling, you're sitting at you're sitting at your keyboard, you Google senior center, the Center for Aging.
Center for the Aging, Google that, and then that will open up a lot of opportunities for you. If you're dealing with, if you're caring for someone who has a Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease or even cancer, diabetes, there's national organizations that you can reach out to that offer all kinds of resources and ideas. Your dad having Parkinson's, you said. I just heard a speaker last week at the Loudoun Senior Interest Group out here in Loudoun County. And she offers like swimming programs for people with Parkinson's. There's dance classes, and there are these fun activities that are available if you only know to look for them, right?
So in other words, you don't have to be alone with this. It just takes some research, a little bit of effort, and it could really change the trajectory of their lives, and it can ease the burden on your life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You just have to know to look. There are support groups if that's something that's interesting to you. Some people get a lot out of a support group. Some people want no part of a support group because they feel like they live this every day and they don't want to go talk to other people about it. There are, in the cases of people with dementia, there are things called memory cafes where they're like meetups for people, caregivers and their loved ones with dementia, that happen sometimes once a week, twice a month, once a month, and they meet in a common area. And those are a lot of fun because that becomes a social opportunity for you. And a lot of caregivers who are caring for someone with dementia don't want to go out socially because there's a stigma attached. It's a mental health.
The same thing for parents with kids with disabilities.
Absolutely.
Figuring out ways to go out and be social, go to places to go on vacation. And now people are starting to build places so the kids with disabilities can go on vacation and their parents can get a rest also.
Absolutely. The respite is huge, right? And that's important. And respite doesn't have to mean a trip away or a vacation away. Respite could be, 1 day a week that you can go. You don't have to care for your loved one at home if you are with them full time. If you have children, it's getting your children involved and with friends who have, common interests or maybe common struggles. Then that, emotionally is so good for a child with disabilities to know they're not alone, right? And to be able to have fun and do things with other kids who might be dealing with similar things. So those resources are available. You just have to look. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of physicians who are going to give you a diagnosis and then hand you over a packet of, now that you know that you're dealing with this, let me help you, find out what's available to you. You're kind of on your own.
You are. But, what I found with a lot of the physicians is they don't even actually know how to deal with anybody in their 80s or 90s. They don't know how to touch them. They don't know how to talk to them.
Absolutely.
And that's a frightening thing to watch. To watch a doctor get frustrated at a man with Parkinson's who can't talk and yell at him to answer him. It's like, dude, do you understand? You're a doctor. Do you understand what Parkinson's is? He cannot. Right. Speak, right? So let's just focus on the Windward Foundation. What do you do? What do you do at the Windward Foundation for people?
Absolutely. So our focus is all on the caregiver, and we have several different layers. So we fund a program, we partner with the Alzheimer's Association, and we fund a program for care consultations. And that is kind of a one-stop shop where you can sit down with the social worker after you have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And that's your first step in kind of developing a roadmap, right? So you can find out what resources are available to you, any kind of memory care or assisted living in your community that might be available to you. If you need help with Medicare or Medicaid issues, they can put you in contact with those people. So the Windward Foundation funds that program and impacts a lot of people in this area. You know, Alzheimer's.
That's in the Washington D.C. area.
That's in the Washington D.C. area.
And do you have resources, or is there a place for where people can look for, because people listen all over the world, but all over this country, where they can find those kinds of resources that are similar to Windward?
That's a tough one, right? So that's like Google. You know, so at this point, you know, we don't, we kind of focus on this area here
Sure.
For the work that we do at the foundation. You have like Us Against Alzheimer's, which is a national worldwide organization.
So that's the question I have: is what do you put in Google to get someplace like the Windward Foundation to pop up?
So, right. So you would put like caregiving, Alzheimer's caregiving, we would probably pop up. If you just put in Alzheimer's, you would get probably Us Against Alzheimer's and the Alzheimer's Association, right? And they do a lot of work. Their primary focus is on research, right? And finding a cure for the disease. If you're I would always suggest people to research whatever, you know, make sure that caregiving is in your search, right? Because that's really, you are, you know, taking on the role of caring for someone with whatever condition they might have. And you need to find other people like yourself who are dealing with a similar thing, right? So my advice there would be, you know, to kind of include caregiving in your search.
That's great. That's a great tip.
Whether it's Parkinson's or, you know, diabetes or cancer or Alzheimer's, you know, caregivers. And then there's caregiving networks like ourselves, you know, where we help a lot of people locally. We work with a local memory cafe. We do some educational series going on. We have a lot of really interesting and fun things happening that are going to deal with helping the community, hospitals and nursing homes, rehab facilities become more dementia friendly. So like you mentioned, you're, you know, taking your parent and the doctors don't know how to communicate with them. So we are working with some trainers, and we are actually training an emergency room staff, a nursing home facility, and educating their entire staff on being dementia friendly. So that includes communicating with them and understanding how to detract when there's, you know, behavior that is difficult, and understand and even see that someone has dementia. You know, I don't know if you encountered this with your dad, but as a caregiver, another thing that's so frustrating is you go to the hospital, and if for some reason, and as our parents get older, there's a lot of hospital visits, unfortunately. So you go to registration, and if they happen to be with you or a capable spouse that isn't dealing with some other dementia on their own, you know, they hand you the clipboard. You know, Mr. McDermott, you know, fill this paperwork out. Not going to happen.
Right, Mr. McDermott doesn't know where he is. He's not going to fill out the paperwork.
Right. Or they're going to say, in your case, you know, let me ask you a question. What's your name? What's your date of birth? He's not going to answer those questions. He's not capable of answering those questions. So a caregiver, that's another really stressful environment, because here you are again, trying to be the caring source for your loved one, and your anxiety is just rising because you know that they don't get it, and you haven't even gotten in the door yet.
Right.
You know?
To the place where you're supposed to try to get help.
Where you're supposed to get help. So, you know, there's so many different layers to the onion that, you know, it's so very challenging.
Well, thank you. So is there anything else you'd like to leave the audience with after this conversation?
I think I would just encourage your audience to just be aware, especially when you're dealing with parents. Be aware of your healthy parent, right? If you be aware of both of them, but really pay attention, because caregivers, it doesn't matter your age. I'm was caring for my dad in my, late 40s, early 50s. I'm not going to tell people that I'm struggling, you know, like I'm fine when I'm really not so fine,
Yeah.
right? So keep an eye on your healthy parents, because oftentimes so much focus is on your loved one with some sort of condition that you're caring for
Well, I
them.
think what you're just saying is not only your healthy parent, but also the caregiver who might be
The
the
care,
child who looks
right.
like they have it all together because they're such troopers. How do you get them to go replenish?
Yeah, just watch, actually watch out for children. When this with the rising cost of assisted living and memory care and nursing facilities, it's so expensive. And if many families will bring their loved ones, their older parents, into their own home, because they just are trying to save money as much as they can. And watch your children. um, Watch your children, and just keep a lookout, because they might be all smiles and seem normal teenagers, but that's a lot to take in, a lot, and they don't really understand. And you know a lot of caregivers are, they don't understand why their activities are going away, because mom and dad are so focused on grandma and grandpa, or mom is so focused on dad. And that's kind of creating a whole nother thing that those children and teens are going to deal with as they get older, as they feel like they were kind of the left behind.
Right. And now
um
that could be gold for them if they're guided properly, and it's another life experience that they can grow
Absolutely.
from. But if they're neglected, then they don't know what to do, and they make of it what they will. So
Right. And
that's actually brilliant. I'm so glad that we stayed on long enough for you to share that. I really appreciate it.
that's an important one, because they often get lost, and we think about ourselves, we don't think about our children, because we think, oh, they're fine, they have school, they have soccer, they have basketball, they're fine. No, there aren't. Maybe they are, and maybe that you're communicating in a way that you're making sure that they are. But I think there's an awful lot of people that aren't recognizing that, because all of their focus is going to caregiving and working or paying the bills, and so that's another concern.
So, that, like everything else, consciousness has to be brought to it, because it just doesn't automatically happen. Your attention and your energy goes to the place that's kind of sucking it from you, rather than consciously moving it over and spreading it around and then spreading it to yourself.
Absolutely.
Michele, thank you
Absolutely.
so much for this was so useful. When I first started looking for help for my parents, I didn't even know where to start. Didn't even know where to Google. So this gives us a place to start. We'll put in the show notes some of the stuff that you talked about, so that if you are a caregiver, you can start going to get help for yourself, help for the person that you're caring for, and that maybe we can loosen up some of this burden.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me.
So I appreciate everything that you shared. To everybody else, thanks for hanging in with us. I think this was a absolutely worthwhile conversation to have. I love you, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.